48 hours ago, the President of the United States ordered criminal charges against the most powerful unelected official in America. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is now under criminal investigation. Grand jury subpoenas were served, threats of indictment were made, and Powell responded with something that's never happened in 110 years of Federal Reserve history. He declared war on the president. In a video statement that shattered every precedent of central bank diplomacy, Powell said the investigation isn't about building renovations or congressional testimony. It's about one thing. Who controls interest rates? Who decides whether your mortgage payment goes up or down? Who determines if your savings earn 0.1% or 5%? Who controls the most powerful economic weapon on earth? This is not about Jerome Powell. This is not about Donald Trump. This is about the end of an illusion that has shaped global finance for over a century. The illusion that central banks are independent. The illusion that monetary policy serves the public interest rather than political power. The illusion that there's a separation between government and the money supply. That illusion just died, and what comes next will reshape every aspect of your financial life. Let me show you exactly what happened, why it happened, and what it means for your money. Because this is not a political story disguised as economics. This is an economic earthquake disguised as a political spat. The Federal Reserve has never faced criminal investigation since it was created in 1913. No Fed chair has ever been served grand jury subpoenas. No central bank in the developed world has ever been subjected to criminal prosecution by the government. It supposedly serves independently. Until now. January 10th, 2026. The Department of Justice serves the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas. The investigation targets Powell's testimony to the Senate Banking Committee in June 2025. The official reason? Cost overruns on the Fed's headquarters renovation. The project budget exploded from $1.9 billion to $2.5 billion. Critics claim luxury features, special elevators, rooftop gardens. Powell denies these allegations. But here's what makes this extraordinary. The DOJ doesn't investigate budget overruns. They don't prosecute construction cost mistakes. They don't issue criminal subpoenas for congressional testimony discrepancies unless someone believes a crime was committed. What crime could the chairman of the Federal Reserve possibly have committed by testifying about building renovations? January 12th, 2026. Powell releases a video statement, not a written press release, not prepared remarks at a scheduled press conference, a direct-to-camera video posted by the Federal Reserve itself. In that statement, Powell says something that no Fed chair has ever said in public. The criminal investigation is political retaliation, it's intimidation, it's an attempt to force the Fed to cut interest rates to satisfy presidential preferences rather than economic conditions. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public rather than following the preferences of the president. Those words just ended Federal Reserve independence forever, not because Powell said them, because they're true, and everyone knows they're true. For over a year, Trump has demanded aggressive rate cuts. He's called Powell incompetent, a political hack, not very smart. He's threatened to fire Powell multiple times. He's attacked Fed Governor Lisa Cook with mortgage fraud allegations that prosecutors have found baseless. He's suggested filing lawsuits against Powell for building cost overruns. And now, criminal charges. This is not monetary policy, this is extortion. Cut rates or face prosecution. Here's the math that explains why this is happening. The United States government pays over $1 trillion annually just in interest on the national debt. Every percentage point increase in interest rates costs the Treasury roughly $340 billion per year. Current Fed rates sit at 4.5%. If rates stay there, interest costs will exceed $1.4 trillion annually by 2027. That's more than defense spending, more than Social Security, more than Medicare, just interest, on money borrowed to fund previous spending. At 6% rates, which is historically normal, interest costs would approach $2 trillion annually. At that point, the government would need to choose between defaulting on debt, cutting spending dramatically, or inflating the currency to reduce real debt burdens. But here's what makes the math impossible. The debt isn't stable. It's growing by $2.5 trillion annually. Every year, more borrowing. Every year, higher total debt. Every year, larger interest payments. At 4.5% rates and current spending trajectories, interest costs will consume 25% of all government revenue by 2030. At 6% rates, interest costs would exceed 35% of revenue. That's debt trap territory. That's the point where governments lose the ability to fund basic operations without printing money. This is why Trump wants rate cuts. Not to help the economy, to prevent fiscal catastrophe. The Federal Reserve knows this. They've known it for years. They also know that cutting rates while inflation runs above target creates bigger problems than fiscal stress. They know that accommodating unsustainable government borrowing by keeping rates artificially low is exactly how currencies collapse. They know that their mandate is price stability and employment, not government budget relief. So they've maintained rates at levels they believe are appropriate for economic conditions, not political convenience. Until now. Powell's statement reveals something that was always true but never said openly. The Fed is not independent. It cannot be independent. When government debt reaches unsustainable levels, when interest payments threaten fiscal stability, when political pressure becomes existential, independence becomes impossible. The choice becomes accommodation or elimination, cut rates or face prosecution, support the government or lose your position, comply or be destroyed. This is not unique to America. Every central bank in history has faced this moment. The Bank of England in the 1970s, the Bundesbank before European Monetary Union, the Bank of Japan in the 1990s, the moment when fiscal needs overwhelm monetary independence, the moment when governments stop pretending that central banks serve anyone other than the state. The difference is that most central banks surrender quietly. The criminal investigation is unprecedented. But it's not random. It's not arbitrary. It's the logical next step in a process that began the moment government debt became unsustainable and political pressure became irresistible. When accommodation through quiet pressure fails, governments escalate. They use regulatory harassment. They threaten budget cuts. They question officials publicly. They investigate personal finances. They find legal pretexts for prosecution. They destroy careers and reputations until compliance is achieved or resistance is eliminated. Powell's statement is an act of institutional defiance. He's saying the Fed will not surrender independence voluntarily, will not accommodate fiscal irresponsibility quietly, will not cut rates to enable more borrowing and spending, will maintain policies they believe serve the economy rather than the government. This is unprecedented courage. It's also probably futile, because governments always win these confrontations. They control the legal system. They control the regulatory apparatus. They control the budget. They control the appointment process. They control the narrative. The markets understand this. On January 13th, the day after Powell's statement, the Dow dropped over 400 points. The dollar declined against major currencies. Bond yields spiked as investors priced in higher political risk. Gold jumped to new all-time highs. These are not responses to economic fundamentals. These are responses to institutional breakdown. When the independence of the central bank is openly questioned, when criminal prosecutions become tools of monetary policy, when political pressure replaces economic analysis, markets lose confidence in the entire framework. Here's what most people don't understand. Federal Reserve independence was never about protecting the Fed. It was about protecting the currency. When central banks become tools of political convenience, when monetary policy serves fiscal needs rather than economic stability, when rate decisions are made to accommodate government borrowing rather than manage inflation, currencies lose credibility. Investors demand higher returns to compensate for debasement risk, capital flees to safer jurisdictions, import costs rise, living standards fall, the middle class gets destroyed through inflation that serves political expediency. The criminal investigation is a threat not just to Powell. It's a threat to every future Fed official. It's a message. Comply or be prosecuted. Accommodate or face destruction. Cut rates or lose everything. This changes the incentive structure permanently. Future Fed officials will know that independence is a luxury they cannot afford. That their career and freedom depend on political satisfaction rather than economic judgment. That monetary policy must serve the state rather than the public. Powell's term as chairman expires in May 2026. 4 months. Trump will nominate a replacement who understands the new reality. Someone who will cut rates aggressively without public confrontation. Someone who will accommodate fiscal needs without institutional resistance. Someone who will manage the decline quietly rather than fight it openly. The most likely candidate is Kevin Hassett, Trump's National Economic Council director. Hassett has already signaled support for much lower rates. He's criticized the Fed's current stance as too restrictive. He's advocated for policies that prioritize short-term growth over long-term stability. But here's the critical detail that everyone is missing. Powell's term as chairman expires in May, but his term as a Fed governor lasts until January 2028. He could remain on the Fed board even after losing the chairmanship. He could continue voting on interest rate decisions. He could continue challenging Trump's preferred policies from within the institution. He could make Trump's appointee fight for every rate cut. This explains the escalation to criminal charges. They're not just trying to remove Powell from the chairmanship, they're trying to remove him entirely, to eliminate his voice completely, to ensure total compliance. The Supreme Court will hear arguments later this month on the Lisa Cook case. Cook is another Fed governor that Trump is trying to remove. The case will determine whether presidents can fire Fed officials for cause based on policy disagreements. If the court rules in favor of presidential authority, it will effectively end Fed independence forever. If they rule against Trump, it will escalate the conflict further. Foreign central banks are watching with alarm. China holds $800 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. If they believe the Fed will be forced to accommodate government borrowing, they will sell. Massively. That would force rates higher despite Fed policy, creating a bond market crisis that triggers exactly the fiscal catastrophe rate cuts are supposed to prevent. Every central bank faces similar pressures. Powell's defeat would signal that independence is impossible when fiscal needs become desperate. This is why Powell's statement matters beyond American politics. It's a test case for whether independent monetary policy can survive sovereign debt crises, whether central banks can maintain credibility when governments become insolvent, whether the institution of central banking, as conceived after World War II, can survive the fiscal realities of the 21st century. The evidence suggests it cannot. Every developed nation faces similar debt dynamics. Every government confronts similar political pressures. Every central bank operates under similar constraints. The outcome of this confrontation will determine whether we continue to pretend that monetary policy is independent or acknowledge that it has become purely political, whether we maintain the fiction that central banks serve the public interest or admit they serve the state, whether we preserve institutional frameworks that no longer function or build new systems appropriate for current realities. Powell's statement forces this choice. It makes the contradictions explicit. It demands that we choose between independence and accommodation, between institutional integrity and political convenience. Your financial future depends on this outcome. If Powell wins, expect higher rates, stable currency, controlled inflation, position for institutional integrity. If Powell loses, expect currency debasement, rising inflation, politicized monetary policy, position for fiscal accommodation. The markets are already choosing. Gold hits all-time highs. Dollar weakens. Bond yields spike. These aren't economic trades. These are institutional credibility trades. Powell's statement was a declaration of war, not against Trump personally, against the political capture of monetary policy, against the subordination of economic judgment to fiscal needs, against the destruction of institutional independence. It was also probably his last stand, because governments win these wars. They have more weapons. They control the battlefield. They write the rules. But resistance matters even when it fails. It establishes precedent. It defines principle. It forces explicit choices rather than quiet surrender. The Fed has been captured before. The 1940s war financing. Powell's resistance is an attempt to preserve an institution that may no longer be viable under current conditions, to maintain independence that fiscal reality makes impossible, to protect credibility that political pressure destroys. It's admirable. It's principled. It's probably doomed, because the mathematics of government debt ultimately overwhelm the politics of central bank independence. When borrowing becomes existential, when interest costs become unbearable, when fiscal collapse becomes imminent, governments always choose accommodation over credibility. They always sacrifice monetary independence for fiscal survival. The criminal investigation will probably succeed. Powell will probably be forced out. The Fed will probably accommodate. Rates will probably fall despite inflation risks. The currency will probably weaken despite global concerns. The precedent will be established. Future central bankers will understand the new reality, comply or be criminalized, accommodate or be destroyed, serve the government or lose everything. The age of independent monetary policy is ending, not with a whimper, but with a criminal indictment. This is not the beginning of the crisis. It's the end of pretending the crisis doesn't exist. The beginning was decades of unsustainable borrowing. The middle was years of artificial rate suppression. The end is the explicit politicization of monetary policy. The criminal investigation is just the mechanism. The collapse of Fed independence is the inevitable result of fiscal mathematics that no institution can resist forever. Your money, your savings, your future purchasing power, all of it depends on understanding this transition. From independent monetary policy to political accommodation, from economic judgment to fiscal convenience, from institutional integrity to government survival. Position accordingly. Because the war between Trump and Powell is really a war between fiscal reality and monetary principle, and fiscal reality always wins.